sorry we're not in person, but this is like maybe the next best thing that we can do these days. Okay, if you can see my screen, that's great. If you can't, someone say something. I'm going to talk about strategy and design and how the two interplay today. And I'm going to go really quickly through these first slides because Al asked me to show you, have me introduce myself. I'm a designer. I'm an industrial designer, an automobile designer specifically by training, but I went into information design very quickly right out of school. In fact, before I graduated with my undergrad degree. So I've been used to a lot of different kinds of heavy information sets and data sets. I have a fair amount of gray hair, so this was quite a while ago when computers were just starting to come online. And basically I grew up in interaction design back when it was called multimedia, in fact. So that's the bulk of my professional experience. As Eyal said, I've written a bunch of books, mostly on design, but increasingly on business because of this connection between design and business. And then along the way, because I grew up in Silicon Valley where company was no big deal, I've done a lot of consulting for big companies and small companies alike. And then I've started a few initiatives myself, as Eyal mentioned. I began and ran the DMBA program, the Design Strategy program at CCA, California College of the Arts, ran it for about 10 years. And that's really that was my laboratory for combining design and business, specifically about strategy in new ways. And we invented new tools, some of which I'll talk to you about today. I've started a couple companies. Some of them were successful, some of them not so successful, but I've been an entrepreneur in my life as well. And then my latest project, as Eyal also mentioned, is this, it's this gigantic design project to crowdsource a set of 600 or more open source icons about the food system that everyone in the world will be able to use freely. So we're right in the middle of that. If you know designers that have a love for icons or an ability for icons, send them to the website because we could use them. The first thing I sort of want to establish is that strategy is really in crisis. And this isn't probably news to a lot of people, but I think that it's a confrontation that the business world is not yet ready to make, or they haven't been. There's a really interesting article that McKinsey did an investigation basically that they reported back on. And their conclusion, this was about, a year and a half ago now, because we've essentially lost a year. They concluded that 85% of companies worldwide are essentially creating no value, and they call them zombie companies. These are companies that either can't service their own debt or essentially are moving money through their company, but they're not creating any value or appreciable profits. This is a big problem because it's a lot of wasted opportunity, but these are the customers of current strategy. And if current strategy or traditional strategy is failing 85% of the companies out there in the world, something's wrong and something needs to change, specifically for those other 85% of the companies. This is why I say strategy is in crisis. And a big reason why is that traditional mechanisms, tools, and approaches to strategy are just incredibly deficient. They were always deficient, and now they're even more deficient, and they're not suited for the times, basically. Some of those reasons are that the reality of most strategy as it's practiced is it's very template-based. People go download a template, fill it out, and think that they've now done strategy. These strategies reflect, these templates and these tools reflect old decisions and really aren't focused on how customers make their decisions. They also mix internal and external factors, and they're not evidence-based. Every company thinks that they know their markets and their customers so well that they can just download these templates, plug things in, and what they get back is essentially a Mad Libs type of strategy. I don't know if everyone is old enough to understand Mad Libs, but it's a game that kids play where they have all these blank spaces that they fill in, usually not knowing how the the choices are going to be used, and then it makes a funny story at the end. But this is exactly how most business strategy is done, because it's not evidence-based and because there's so little connection between the different pieces. Most of strategy is done out of sequence, if it's done completely at all. And that robs the ability of different parts of the different lenses in the strategic process to affect the other lenses, the other sorts of investigations. And then the biggest problem is that most business people abhor qualitative research. They focus only on quantitative data, and therefore they're missing an entire lens, and a very important lens, when they build their strategy. I'll talk about that a little bit more. This is one of the places that design research can reinvigorate the kinds of market research that are currently used in most kinds of strategy. Lastly, let's go back one. Lastly, strategy is often done in isolation. It's not connected to the day-to-day business operations, the activities of the company. So there's no sort of real-time check or validation against the strategy. Strategy is done, occasionally. It's often done, maybe 3 to 5 years, and then it's put on a shelf and looked at, or never looked at again until 3 to 5 years later, we're going to redo our strategy. So in summary, there's all these problems with the traditional business approach to strategy, and I believe that design fixes a lot of these problems. So that's what I'm going to really concentrate on. But first, I want to start with a story. This is Apple's stock price. I'm going to talk about success in a very narrow focus right now, which is just sort of market cap and money. And if you look at Apple's stock price over history, and I know this is a little bit truncated, it's almost 10 years old or 8 years old now. So it's gone up even more. But if you look at Apple's history, Apple was a successful company throughout most of its history. It was profitable. It was recognized for doing well business-wise, but they were always treated as a niche company by investors and analysts in the market in general. And then something really interesting started happening about 2004, 2005. You could see its fortunes start to rise. And then they really kick in around 2008, 2009. And what happened wasn't the iPod. It wasn't iTunes. It was actually the iTunes Music Store, which launched in 2003. But by 2004, the market said, oh, you're not a niche computer company anymore. You're a music company, specifically a digital music publisher. So we're going to reevaluate what we think that you're worth and where we think your potential is. This was obviously really good for Apple, really important to them. It's worth noting that the iPod was sort of just a curiosity. It was almost an accident in terms of it getting greenlit within the company. But obviously, by 2012, 2013, or even earlier, by 2007, 2008, this is reversing it's performing very well for Apple, and they want to keep this going. Now, you have to pair that at the time with an understanding of what was going on in digital tools. And so we have these projections of fixed line phones moving to mobile phones. We know that more people are going to be using mobile phones. But the piece that's missing here was essentially a piece that design research can uncover, which is Apple realized that people don't want to carry more than about 3 things in their pockets. They don't want full pockets all the time. At the time, those 3 things were keys, wallet, and something else. In Apple's case, that something else was very often an iPod. And that was really important because that's why this was happening for them. In other cases, it might have been a PDA or a digital camera or one of a couple other devices. But that understanding about how people want to live is really more of a qualitative understanding. It's how the quality of being in the world was a limiting factor. So Apple knew that people weren't going to add a 4th device. Certainly most people, maybe the people that run around with the safari jackets with, 50 pockets, they might add a 4th device, but most people weren't. So this data, which was really critical, doesn't matter unless you pair it with the data about experience in being a digital person living in the world back in 2000, 2004, 2005. That's what made this important. Without that, this just looks like not a threat to a company that's not in the phone business. So what does Apple decide to do? Their strategy is they know they need to get into the phone. And so what do? This is usually when I talk to classes, this is when everyone says they made the iPhone. And the answer is no, they didn't make the iPhone. They made a big mistake. Their first phone, the phone that put iTunes into the phone, was actually a collaboration between Apple and Motorola. And it was a very good strategic reason why they did this. Making a mobile phone was a $1 billion investment that they had no experience in. They had no real technology in. So they partnered with who at the time, at least here in the United States, was the biggest and best-selling phone manufacturer around. And it was a total disaster. So what did they do then? Well, they went back to the drawing board and said, okay, I guess we have to be a phone company. And they decided to change their strategy. Rather than partnering, they did their own phone internally. And then we all know what happened. Totally changed Apple's fortunes, changed their influence in digital life, right? But many companies would have said, well, this was a disaster. It was the wrong strategy. I guess we shouldn't do that. What Apple knew was that this was still going to happen to them. They couldn't change the forces of the market or trends. They knew that people still weren't going to be carrying more than 3 things in their pockets. So they knew that they couldn't not get into the phone, basically. But they changed how they were going to approach that problem, and then they did a much more successful job. But this strategy hinged on what we commonly find out in things like design research. Without it, it's just a quantitative exercise that could easily have convinced Apple that they didn't have to get into the phone business at all, let alone make their own phone, because that was essentially an absurd strategy at the time. So in Apple's case, design is the thing that changed their strategy. It adds back the qualitative into the strategy that was missing. And it's not just Apple, it's all sorts of companies. Oops. I seem to have, there we go. All right, there's a little delay here, sorry. It's not just Apple. So there's a bunch of people who have spent time, organizations like the DMI in London. You have the Design Council. In my program, the DMBA program, we had our own index. There's a bunch of companies that track those companies and their performance, that pay attention to design and use it strategically. And all of them, every single one, shows that design added to these companies increases their value over their competitors. So we know that there's a financial bottom line that connects with this. And it's not just companies. The same is true for nonprofits, NGOs, B Corps. The same could be true for government agencies. Not that their valuation would go up, but their effectiveness would go up, and their ability to do more with whatever budgets that they have. So this is a universal phenomenon that designers can have impact on the world, certainly in the organizational world. I'm developing a new model for strategy because these tools are not serving us well. This is the basis for it. It's a recognition that strategy needs to be continuous, that it's circular, that it moves back and forth. It moves through a cycle that is continuous, and that design research, qualitative research in particular, needs to be fundamentally part of this process. Also, because, by the way, that's what adds the evidence. So rather than using templates that have no place for evidence, that are disconnected from each other, we can create a cohesive, continuous strategic tool, basically, or process that integrates evidence that can essentially validate the conclusions that we come to. Sequence becomes important because the output of any one of these lenses becomes the input to the other lenses. One of the biggest problems with strategy is that customer experience, again, this is where design really comes in, is very much missing from most corporate strategy. They jump into competition and competitive analysis. They jump into positioning. If they do environmental analysis at all, it might come too late, or they miss the customer decision drivers. And almost always they're only looking at quantitative data. So they're missing an incredibly important part of the equation. So there's a new formula that we need to build into strategy, and that we as designers are responsible for, and we're really good at these aspects. Value, and we need a new definition of value, comes from relationships. If you don't have a relationship, you don't have any kind of mechanism for you to trade value, to sell someone something, to trade them for something else. This means that everyone's in the relationship business, whether they believe it or not, whether they acknowledge it or not. And relationships only happen within the context of experiences. So everyone's in the experience business, whether they acknowledge it or not. Value, relationships, and experiences is exactly what design research, design strategy, and design processes bring to business and bring to the equation. So we're really well set up, and we have access to really critical tools to bring the missing component to most strategy. In my program, in the DMBA program, we taught that there were 5 different kinds of value, for instance, that we identified. And while traditional business, and therefore business tools, only focus on the functional and the financial, in the tech world, we call that price and performance, or price and features, to the exclusion of everything else, these other 3 kinds of value, the quantitative or the qualitative values, are incredibly important. I don't have a lot of time to go into all of these deeply, but I'll just summarize. Functional value is what we determine meets our needs, right? So this has the features I need if I'm looking for a new car, a new computer, a new house, even a raincoat. Financial value is about how worth it is to me to pay that much versus pay something else. Where things get really interesting and important, and where design excels in this realm, is emotional value. How does this make me feel? And often this is indirect. It's often unconscious. We don't always recognize that our emotions are playing a part in our decision making, but they're incredibly powerful. Every salesperson on the planet knows that if they're negotiating with someone strictly on the basis of price or features, they've lost the sale. It's here in the qualitative realm that they have all the room to be a good salesperson. Next, there's identity value. These things get stronger and more stable as they get closer to us. So think of this as shells around us that we make decisions based on. And these qualitative values are so central to our identity and our being that we often don't know that they're playing a part in our decisions at all. Last, there's meaningful value, which means it connects with our meaning systems and our worldview. So the first thing that we can do as designers is research these kinds of value, because our peers, the rest of our business peers, are not, and then put them into the business strategy process so that we can show that there's entirely new opportunities to create new kinds of value that's been there all along. It's just invisible to most business tools. So the quant and the qual. And the, business people aren't dumb. They know there's that something else happening beyond price and performance, but they don't have the tools to communicate it, to talk about it, and to work with it. And that's really where design comes in. So they develop all these kinds of weird equations, none of which are right, because they still approach it as a quantitative problem when the fundamental nature of these other 3 kinds of value are qualitative. So here's an example of how it plays out in the real world. Instagram was purchased by Facebook, as many of you remember, in 2012. At the time, it was purchased for $1.1 billion. It was seen as a ludicrous amount of money for 13 people to create that much value in, a year and a half or something. And we can look at the numbers now, and we know that the books, the accounting system that Instagram used the day before the sale said it was an $86 million company. And 50 million of that came from investors the week before the sale. So we know what's going on there. The day after the sale, there's an extra 100 bill, I'm sorry. There's an extra $1 billion that have to be accounted for. And so the accounting system has to throw that somewhere, and that's called goodwill. On a balance sheet in accounting, you have a little cell for things called goodwill. And literally, this is how they solve the problem. They shove this extra $1 billion in that cell, and their balance sheet balances, and they're all happy. The problem is that all of the accounting systems and the business tools that businesses use to build value, to manage themselves, are only looking at that top line, book value. There's no acknowledgement. There's no way to work with it. There's no place for this extra $1 billion in the management system of a company until the day it gets sold, or maybe it goes public. And this isn't just true of Instagram. It's not just true of tech companies. Any healthy company that goes public or gets acquired by another company always has this extra goodwill. And that extra value is often many, many times more than the book value of the company, right? $1 billion or more than $1 billion is a lot more than $86 million. And this is an essential problem with managing companies, especially starting companies, because every business person is trying to create that billion extra dollars of value, but all of their tools ignore it and in fact fight the building and creation of that value. Again, this is where designers and design processes and tools excel, because we're in charge of that qualitative value. That's what we're good at. And that's what our tools help us help make visible and help us use them in reliable processes. So those companies that care about total value, that look at the qualitative and the quantitative, are just simply in a better position to create more of it more often. And the business term for this is premium value. That's their code word for people like you a lot more than your competitors, and therefore you can charge more. But that's as sophisticated as their traditional tools get. So all value sits within a relationship. All relationships sit within an experience. There's many aspects to the experience that designers understand and can build and work with. And this then becomes the mechanism for companies to create better experiences, that create better relationships, that create new opportunities, and therefore they can create new value. Of course, this requires us to do business differently. I think it was Einstein's quote that says you can't use the same thinking process to solve the problems that were created in the old thinking process. So my corollary is you can't use the same tools and specifically strategic tools to build your way out of these zombie situations where companies are creating essentially no value at all. The mechanisms for doing this are well known to design. We teach them every day in our programs and our schools. It's design research, which emphasizes the qualitative, doesn't ignore the quantitative, but its special sauce that it brings to the business world is the qualitative. And then the mechanisms, the tools and processes we use to design things becomes incredibly strategic. And therefore we can create a whole new class of value more consistently and reliably than essentially how traditional businesses do it right now, which is either intuition or luck. And that's not a good way to run a business. There's a bunch of these new tools. If you go to the front page of my website, I'm cataloging new strategic tools, new systems tools, especially sustainability tools, and new leadership tools. And some of these involve stakeholder analysis, which we bring over from systems design, the wave line, which I've written several books on with my co-author, this idea of continuous strategy. So strategy and operations live side by side, intermingled. Strategy isn't put on the shelf for 3 to 5 years and then taken and looked at again. And this idea of creating meaningful value and the strategies and tools for doing that. This is what some of them look like. We have stakeholder analysis. And then when you do your stakeholder analysis with this idea of these 5 different kinds of value, you can map value across your stakeholders and see opportunities that you would never have seen before to create more value. Here's the wave line, which is a way of plotting the customer experience in terms of value and meaning. It emphasizes emotional identity and meaning value because that's where all the real value ends up being. And it becomes a mechanism for communicating this, especially to people who don't believe that qualitative value even exists or that there's any way to work with it. So those design doubters. There's these 5 kinds of value, and meaning in particular. Meaning is a set of 15 categories that we can design meaningful experience the same way that you might look at a color palette of colors and design a pleasing painting or design, whether it's a physical object or graphic design, using colors that work together. We can do the same thing with meaningful experiences by putting this in our design research process, understanding how our customers prioritize and express meaning, and then putting that into the design process. We have tools for looking at experience and designing with experience. Again, these are things that we teach every day in our programs. I think I'm going to end there because I have a whole lot more slides. Eyal knows that I have way more than I could possibly talk to, but I want to leave time for Q&A. So what I'm going to do is just sort of jump to the very end and open up for questions, and then we can discuss about the other kinds of things. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Nathan, for this incredible overview. And I have a few questions of my own, but before that, I'll be more than happy to share the floor with anyone who has any question to Nathan. Please feel free.
Yeah, I know that was a lot to digest, and I apologize, but I'm happy to go into any detail here, especially if you disagree. There's a question I see in chat. Are the values organized by their importance? They're not. So one way that some people look at these 5 kinds of value is they do a quick comparison to maybe Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The difference between these 5 kinds of value is they're not levels the same way that Maslow's hierarchy of needs works. In Maslow's model, you can't really focus on any of the higher needs unless the needs below them have been met. And that's not the case here in product and service development, for instance. You can be operating on a meaning level and not paying attention, let's say, to function, and still be successful if that's where your customers are and that's where you're meeting them. It's more a matter of all 5 of these things are changing dynamically in real time all the time, which is why research techniques that uncover them are so critical. Because it's not just you and your customer, there's a bunch of other things constantly interacting between the two of you in the relationship. Things happen in the world, they happen in the news, there's events, competitors do and say things, and all of those are dynamically affecting those meaning systems, not to mention emotions and identity. So you can't just look at you vis-a-vis, or your products and services vis-a-vis your customers, because there's a lot more going on in the situation. So it's not that any of these are more important than the other. It's really more a matter of where you play in business. And that's why strategy needs to make room for them, because if you don't see them, you can't prioritize and you can't compare them to maybe your strengths and weaknesses as a company are. There's another question. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Would I say that business and entrepreneurship focused designers have an edge on other entrepreneurs? Absolutely. This is one of the reasons why we created the DMBA program. Although it wasn't just for teaching business to designers, that would kind of get boring after a while. It was just as important to teach design to business people and entrepreneurs. This is about seeing the whole picture. And traditional business tools now have a very narrow view of the world, and it's a quant-based view outside of some very rough and nebulous sort of brand research tools and brand investigations. Business tools are missing, the majority of value in the market, and they're missing the majority of what's happening in their customers' minds. And so design brings that missing component. It's not that designers are better at this than business people, although, anyone that's gone through design school and understood critiquing process and what it means to have, something you've created shot down and then improved with that critique is probably better suited to business, just because that's essentially what the market's doing to you every day. I don't think you have to be a designer to be a better entrepreneur, but if you don't understand design research, design thinking, design strategy, you have purposefully or inadvertently, ignored skills that are incredibly critical.
There's another question in the chat, I think, if you want to take it.
Yeah. What business tool resource would you recommend designers engage in? I don't think there's any one. I think there's a bunch of them. I particularly like systems thinking tools like stakeholder analysis. When you pair them with things like 5 kinds of value and place them, in a business context, you see a lot more than you would miss otherwise. I think that, the business model canvas has revolutionized business, basically. And business schools that haven't understand that or haven't found the business model canvas are really at a disadvantage, because we're educating a generation of new business people who understand how to make business models better. And it's very much a design tool. In fact, it's a fairly visual design tool. Before this tool, if you were in a certain industry, the way you chose your business model is, there's 3 prevailing business models in your industry. Make a choice where you want to play and how. Now we have a tool, and the reason why I call it a designerly tool, now we have a tool that helps you custom create a business model based on, your customers, your own strengths and weaknesses, and how you can put things together in a way that is competitive, that, people just couldn't do very easily, or again, they had to do intuitively. So it's a really important tool. And at the same time, it's a really deficient tool because it's missing a bunch of pieces too. So we have new versions and evolutions of the business model canvas, like, let's see, the Flourishing Business Canvas is one of my favorites, because then it integrates nature and social and environmental impacts into the business model as well, which is where we all need to go. And those things are missing from traditional business too. So there's a few of these tools out there that I think have been really helpful to entrepreneurs that are open to doing things in a new way. And as they get hired by other companies, if they don't feel like being an entrepreneur, they can go be an intrapreneur within a company and ultimately radically change how that company makes its decisions. So there's a bunch of those.
So Nathan, I have a bunch of questions about ourselves for free. So I noticed this funny little phenomenon that throughout your talk, people were trickling in at all times. So there were always people getting into the room, but at the same time, the number of participants stayed pretty much the same, which means that people were leaving. So they might have left because they didn't like you or because they found you uninteresting. But it might also be true because...
Thanks for pointing that out, Eyal.
Well, that's what I'm here for. Honesty is my middle name. And it might also be because the notion of quantifying what we do and putting it in boxes and models and graphs is something that is hard for us, quote unquote, creative people, designers, etc., to grasp and accept. Can you relate to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that that's very real. Not everyone, when I was taught design way back when I was in undergrad, we were taught design in a much different context. We were taught to go out into the world and redesign everything we touched or cared about in our own image, to our own satisfaction. And you have some great design that came out of that. The Bauhaus, distinctive designers like Werner Panton, for instance, whose furniture looks like no one else's, or Luigi Colani, whose everything looks like nobody else. And this was the predominant advice and process of design that we were taught. But the reality is, as designers, up until very recently, we've learned that the designer's aesthetic is very different than most, people who buy things, most citizens out in the world, and that there was a huge mismatch. That's changed a little bit, and it's changed a great deal because of companies like Apple and maybe Target and IKEA, who have made design not just strategic within their business, but have ended up educating the public about design and raised standards and expectations. Nike's another example of this. So many more people have now had access to better design projects. That's not just how they look, but how they work, that there's a much more sophisticated understanding among customers about what is and isn't design and good design and why it's important. So I don't think that we can be those designers anymore. Maybe there's certain niches where we can, expressive typefaces, poster design, motion graphics for movies and TV, for instance, things that don't have to perform in a specific kind of way, or don't have to meet people's needs that are, core needs. I think that that's a great place for design. I hope it never changes. I love, I'm a designer still. I love seeing variety in style. I love seeing new ideas. But when you're going to commit $1 billion to a product, or you're going to affect 1 billion people's lives every day, like Twitter or a Facebook, that's the kind of design that doesn't cut it. You can't just be a style designer. And designers have a particular opportunity now and almost responsibility to get involved with the business model, get involved with the strategy, because, I know people at Facebook and Twitter, and they do not see themselves as the people who destroyed democracy in the United States, but they sure had a hand in doing so. And we can't ignore those issues anymore. And I recognize that's a bunch of new responsibilities that a lot of designers aren't prepared for. They don't feel that's where their strengths are. But if we're not the ones, we're the keepers of the customer needs and desires, we're the keepers of the qualitative. And if we're not going to challenge the technologies around bias, and we're not going to challenge, privacy and security, most other people in business aren't. And so that's our responsibility now. We can't just be about style.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat by Noga. Feel free to take it.
Yeah, at what type of junctions would you recommend for a small or medium-sized business to work with the strategy tools, and what are the trends and values in business today? I don't know if I can speak so well to the latter, because I think business culture is really slow to change. And obviously there are a lot of people being educated with sort of the old business values. That's why, you know, every 10 years, business schools scramble to add, you know, ethics courses to their curriculum because they weren't in there before, and strategic or sustainability courses to their curriculum because that was missing and still is in many cases, et cetera. So I don't know if I could speak to, or I don't think I could speak necessarily positively about business values other than to say they're slowly getting better. They're getting more equitable, they're getting more fair, they're getting more sophisticated, they're taking into account new things, but at a very, very slow pace, much too slow, certainly for equity and justice, and certainly for climate change. What I can maybe speak more to is the first part of that question, which is what, if you're a small or medium-sized company and you can't afford to hire, you know, a McKinsey, let alone a, you know, even a smaller consultancy to do your strategy, what can you do? That's essentially the premise for my next company, which is, why can't we have these tools be a SaaS platform the same way that, you know, you go get your accounting system from Intuit, or what's the company out of New Zealand that does such a good job at this? I'm blanking on the name. Why can't this be a tool that you go online and put your work in, and it helps you make your work? It challenges you on pieces that you don't know. It provides education about parts that you're not familiar with. Why can't it be that easy? And the answer is because no one's built it before. And so my next step is to go build it. But until that's built, you know, I would say go to my homepage and look at the tools that are there. You might start with stakeholder analysis. Certainly start by opening up your eyes to these 5 kinds of value, and then just start asking questions. The first place designers can do this in even small and medium-sized companies is to start asking questions about these kinds of value in our research with customers. Get this information back, and then it's our responsibility to try to communicate that to the rest of the organization. And that's not always easy. Completely understand. There's a lot of business people, even in small and medium-sized companies. They're busy. They don't want to learn something new. They're not sure that what you're talking about is even real. And so this becomes as much a communication issue as it does a tool issue or a process issue or a strategy issue. But by not doing it, it doesn't mean that the problem goes away, in the same sense that, you know, we had the experience economy book from Pine and Gilmore back in 20 years ago now, basically said not everyone's an experience company, only certain companies like Disney are. And they got it essentially wrong, because everyone's an experience company. And if you don't pay attention to it, it just means you're a really crap experience company making really bad experiences. It doesn't mean that you don't get classified as an experience company anymore. So all of these things are at work, whether our tools look at them or not, whether we bother to look at them or not. These issues don't go away. And so even if you took one day out of the year, or, you know, 2 afternoons out of the year or out of the quarter to ask these questions, to talk to your customers the next time you talk to them, and then talk about them internally, you're on a better path than if you ignore them all, you know, all along. So everyone can do a little bit of this.
Thank you. Last one for me, perhaps. So the notion of the idea of the designer, the strategist, or the strategist designer is still mind-boggling, even to us who, in effect, practice it day in, day out. And the perception of the designer in the industry, whichever field, is the gap is still there. So in your mind, or in your view, how do we bridge the gap? Or in other words, what would be the future of the design is a profession and is a place for us designers to make a real impact.
Again, I'll say this isn't for everyone. Not everyone comes into design to do this piece of it. And even our own graduates in the DMBA program, more times than not, have to make a choice and say on their resume and on their job applications and when they go interview, I'm a strategist and I know a little bit of design, or I'm a designer and I know a little bit of strategy, because those companies, most companies out there don't know that there are people that can bridge this gap, don't know that there are people who can translate between the engineers, the business people, the designers, and the others. And so they're not looking for them. And specifically HR departments don't know these people exist and are creating barriers, because you show up as a designer strategist and that doesn't fit any of their job recs. And because no one asked for a designer strategist, you know, you're not going to make it through the process. These are part of the problems of traditional business processes and tools. So that's not for everyone. But I do think that there's an opportunity for designers to have a tremendous amount of more influence in companies, and designer entrepreneurs like the folks that started Airbnb, for instance, to have a big impact and create interesting companies because they bring these two worlds together. But it's not without its work. I mean, you don't have to go get an MBA program, but there are, you know, there's business language that you need to learn so that you can talk their language, because it's very often not the case that traditional business people are going to start talking our language. Again, it comes down to a communication problem. We're often not invited in the room where these decisions are made, and yet that's where we can have the most impact. So sometimes we just need to create sort of the reverse of cultural probes. We almost need to create you know, new kinds of reports that are more like a Mars lander, where we have to send our material and our insights into that room where strategy is being discussed without us. And maybe over time, when that shows value, they'll invite into the room. And then we can be on a little bit more equal footing. But the worst thing we can do is just ignore it altogether and say, I don't want to play that game and I don't know how.
Right. Thank you for that. Any other questions? I'll give it 5 seconds of awkward silence. 2, 1. All right. Nathan, thanks so much for taking the time, being with us your morning, our evening, and for this rich and challenging conversation. I think it'll be okay with you if I speak on your behalf and say, or you can say it yourself, if anybody want to get in touch with you, or if other questions come up, would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that I'm, as of this morning, 170 emails behind. So it may take me a while to get back to you, but I will endeavor to do so. And I'll send Eyal a link. I'll post all these slides, plus the ones I didn't necessarily get to SlideShare or something, and I'll send Eyal the link and he can share them with you.
Thank you. And there are plenty of those. Nathan, thanks so much again. Thanks everyone for joining us. תודה רבה לכולם. ונתראה בהרצאה הבאה שלנו. שיהיה לכם אחלה ערב.
Ta-da.
Bye bye.
Have a good week.